Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 23rd of November in the 47th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, maybe even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we've been on the air. Chomsky said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is November 23rd. On this date in 1644, a pamphlet was published in London called Areopagitica, a speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. That's the full title. It's said to be among history's most influential and impassioned philosophical defenses of the principles of a right to freedom of speech and expression. Many of its expressed principles form the basis for modern justifications of that right. The name Areopagitica comes from a site in Athens, translates as Mars Hill or Rock, of an ancient law court. And the pamphlet is about what the law should do in regulating publishing. A quotation from Milton's pamphlet, quote, "A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life." That quotation is still prominently displayed over the entrance to the renovated main reading room in the New York Public Library. And the Supreme Court of the United States has, in interpreting the First Amendment to the 1787 Constitution, supposedly still in force in this country, has referred to the Areopagitica to explain the amendment's protections. The court cited it, for example, in the landmark New York versus Sullivan case to explain the inherent value of false statements. The Supreme Court also cited Milton to explain the dangers of prior restraint, which is what Milton was writing about in 1644, in a number of other Supreme Court cases. Justice Douglas, concurring in a case called Eisenstadt, cited the pamphlet to support striking down restrictions on lecturing about birth control. And Justice Black cited Areopagitica when, in Communist Party of the United States versus Subversive Activities Control Board, he dissented from the court's upholding of restrictions on the Communist Party of the United States against a free speech and free association challenge. In each case, Milton was cited by the court's members to support a broad and expansive protection of free speech and association. But Milton was not what we'd call in the U.S. today a First Amendment absolutist. He thought some opinions were so horrible that they shouldn't be allowed to be published. He mentions two: superstition, by which he seems to mean a belief in witchcraft, and Roman Catholicism. But with those two exceptions, he says, and I quote, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties." Close quote. In the midst of the Obama administration, which ranks with the Truman and Wilson administrations as the most anti-free speech administrations in the U.S. in the last 100 years, you're listening to News from Neptune, the There Have to Be Some Limits edition. And Ron Szoke, who's been reading Milton to us recently, gets to violate the first limit.
Right. Well, today I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk about pointing the finger of blame. which has become such a prominent activity in the wake of the national elections last week. So let me point the first finger at the imposition of austerity in Europe and in Greece in particular. I don't know, can we blame this one on Angela Merkel? Well, not entirely, but anyway, today on the news, suicide attempts increasing in crisis-stricken Greece. The number of people in Greece trying to kill themselves is rising as economic crisis deepens, according to official figures. There were 677 suicide attempts in 2009, 830 in 2010, and 927 in 2011. The public order minister said in a written response to lawmakers' questions. The number is on course for a further rise this year, with 690 incidents registered by police as of August 23rd. The figures did not clarify how many suicide attempts led to loss of life. A 77-year-old retired pharmacist became a symbol of national anguish when he shot himself dead outside Parliament in Athens in April. He left a note saying he refused to scrounge for food in the garbage. Greece is heading toward a sixth year of recession in 2013. The crisis has thrown 1 in 5 out of work, and gross domestic product has shrunk by a fifth. Many Greeks blame spending cuts and tax hikes demanded by lenders, the European Union, and International Monetary Fund for their plight. So this is consistent with what we've been hearing about the rise of figures on child neglect and abandonment and abuse all over Europe as the austerity craze continues. Anyway, more to the point domestically, I suppose. A curious article in the Wall Street Journal by one Rex Netting, who writes for the Market Watch column there in the journal. He points the finger of blame at the 10 people who led us off the fiscal cliff. We haven't gone off of it completely until January 1st, I guess, and even then it's not such a big deal after all. It's more of a incline or decline, whatever. But here are some of the names. There was only one that I was completely unfamiliar with, but Arthur Laffer of the famous Laffer curve, purporting to show that government revenues would be increased by decreasing taxes. There was some sweet spot where the taxes were high enough to yield the required amount of revenue, but would not be discouraging to investors and capitalists. So that has been completely exploded now, I believe. But hey, there's still some people who may believe it, and it goes all the way back to the Nixon administration. Pete Peterson of the Concord Coalition, for a while the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was extremely active and vivid in talking about the national debt and the horrible consequences of it and what was going to happen unless something was done about it. There are only 2 Democrats or liberals or whatever you want to call them, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, on the list. Alan Greenspan, interestingly enough, is on his list of the guilty parties. George W. Bush, who came up with the wonderful innovation of fighting endless wars abroad while cutting taxes. Indeed, for a while there in the Bush administration, cutting taxes seemed to be the solution to every conceivable problem. Dick Cheney, who announced at one point that the Reagan administration had discovered that deficits don't matter anymore. The one unfamiliar name on his list was David Leary, the chief economist of the National Association of Realtors, who's cheerleading for the real estate bubble a few years ago, led to, some say, a lot of the subprime lending that was going on, and which blew up in the faces of the big banks in 2008. Grover Norquist, who's still trying to make lawmakers sign an anti-tax pledge, and more of them, of course, are refusing to do that. They can't promise to always vote against all tax increases or what he would consider tax increases, that is, the decreases in certain exemptions and so on. Well, I've already mentioned Barack Obama, and then John Boehner, the head of the Republicans in the House, the majority leader, and these are his nominees for the people that we should blame in taking us to the edge of the fiscal cliff, and we should blame them for the consequences that may start to become apparent in January. I regard most of this as nothing more than celebrity gossip, but hey, this is an old game, by the way. Huh? This is an old game, by the way. Who do we blame for our social problems and difficulties? There are a couple of books that I've probably waved around before, where there are whole lists of people who are the villains and are causing the problems. Bernard Goldberg, 100 people who are screwing up America, and Al Franken is number 37. And David Horowitz, the appalling David Horowitz, who wrote a book published in about 2006 called The Professors, the 101 Most Dangerous Academics in America. And on page 84, of course, Noam Chomsky appears. So the point is, if this is taken seriously, then we could solve our problems by getting rid of these people, by eliminating them from the scene, because they're evildoers. One guy, again, to revert to something that I've mentioned before, took this so seriously that he went to a local Unitarian church where there's said to be a lot of liberals and started gunning them down in July of 2008 at the Knoxville suburb of Powell, Tennessee. So if you need a hunting license, why, here are some lists of people that need to be taken out if you believe that they are the ones to be blamed for our problems. So more fallout from the election. An ad on Newsmax.com. Prepare for what's coming. A millionaire patriot thanks and trains you to defend yourself at what's coming at no charge. So Armageddon is nigh, and this guy is offering free training with guns, and he says, I cannot solve all of our country's ills. I cannot advise you on what to do to protect your money or your home or your job, but there's one aspect of the coming storm I can help you weather, and I can help you prepare for better than anyone else in America. My name is Dr. Ignatius Piazza. That's apparently his name. I am the founder and director of Front Sight Firearms Training Institute. My hundreds of thousands of students call me the Millionaire Patriot because I've literally given away millions of dollars of free and discounted training so Americans like you and me can be prepared for what's coming. So there it is. If you need free training in how to handle the guns and deal with the coming catastrophe brought on us by the government, you know where to go. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Ron. Comment on this, David?
Yes. I think certainly we should take seriously where to point fingers of blame when it comes to the economic crisis and the whole series of events that's happened since either 2008 or perhaps since 2001 or perhaps since the 1990s or, of course, even before. But it is a serious comment to talk about Bill Clinton. It might be more accurate to talk about people like Robert Rubin and Timothy Geithner and Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, who really guided the economic process by which so much risk was taken and so much carelessness. Just one thing that the blogger economist Dean Baker points out, a little obscure, maybe a little technical, but just to talk about it in sort of structural terms, the fact that we have a foreign debt to the extent that we do is a result of the devaluation, or no, the hypervaluation of the dollar, especially versus the Chinese currency. And this was a trade policy that goes back at least to the 1990s, was apparently in the Clinton administration most advocated by Robert Rubin in order to make it easier for make it more profitable for American corporations to set up their factories in China and import goods from there. And the fact that we have a trade deficit, as Dean Baker is always pointing out on his blog, his Beat the Press blog, the fact that we have a trade deficit means that we have to have a national savings debt. In other words, either we have to be running a government deficit or we have to be running a deficit in private savings. In practical terms, it means that if we have a $400 billion trade deficit, we have to be running an equal federal debt or federal deficit during that year. Baker refers to it as an accounting identity. It's just something that must follow from that. And so these more subtle but clear, this is a part of the larger pattern by which there was also during the Clinton years, of course, inflation of the stock market, the so-called dot-com bubble. And this has prepared us and been part of a much larger process by which choices made by people who are usually and continue to be thought of as respected. He refers to this fellow Lira, the economist for the National Realtors Association or whatever, somebody who said that the housing bubble just couldn't fail. And Dean Baker is one of those who said that he predicted, along with others, that the housing bubble must burst because it was completely out of line with historical trends. And it certainly did. And for all the claiming that they couldn't have, of people like Alan Greenspan and so forth, that they couldn't have known, there were people who did know. And of course, for very good sort of structural or capitalistic reasons, they couldn't be listened to. So there are, on the one hand, fingers of blame to be pointed, right. But on the other hand, I think we have to keep in mind the nature of the system, the nature of the moral hazard of a system in which profits are seen above all else, as short-term profits are seen as important above all else, in spite of what the fundamentals of economic productivity and growth and so forth.
Good point. I would add to my personal rogues gallery, of course, Larry Summers and
yes, definitely.
Yeah, and those guys. There was a TV documentary about Brooks Lee Bourne, who was warning people about this, but she was overruled by these top economists, and they actually tried to get the crime of fraud eliminated, to try to essentially to legalize fraud.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like the way our culture works is that we have a bad conscience about some people making a lot of money, and then out of that we get certain celebrity criminals like Martha Stewart or Leona Helmsley or even Madoff, who was pretty small potatoes in the context of what was going on. I mean, obviously it was illegal, but his was a more blatant Ponzi scheme. But the whole thing was a Ponzi scheme. The whole securitization thing, the collateralized debt, it's all can be understood as a Ponzi scheme. It should be understood what a Ponzi scheme is, because sometimes the word is used loosely. But Wall Street,
like for Social Security.
Yes, exactly. It's not it's Social Security, right, which is absolutely not a Ponzi scheme. But Wall Street is a Ponzi scheme to a great extent. The manner, especially the manner in which it's operated in the last 20 or 30 years.
So anyway, that was my no Thanksgiving list, and this guy's nominations for the top 10 turkeys of the week.
The problem, it seems to me, is not that someone is pointing a finger of blame, so to speak, as you started, Ron. The problem is to point it in the right direction. And it's really important. I mean, if you get it wrong, all sorts of bad things can happen. We mentioned last time the German Social Democrat August Bebel's remark at the end of the 19th century about European anti-Semitism, when he said anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools. And one of the most predictive remarks, I'm afraid, for the 20th and apparently the 21st century. What he meant was that in looking to point the finger of blame for the economic disorders of 19th and then 20th century capitalism, there are some people who recognize quite rightly that there was something profoundly wrong with the way in which the society's economy was organized, and they looked around to who the culprit was, try to decide who was responsible for the fact that people were poor, that people were out of work, that there was a depression even by the 1930s, and they answered the question wrong. Instead of saying the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, and the answer had been out there for a long time, it had been clear to many people what the situation actually was, instead of saying that, and they're saying that their role, the role of the bourgeoisie, had to be transformed, that is, the economy had to be set up so that it served the interests of people rather than the interests of the very few. They instead said, no, the culprit are the Jews. Anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools because it was an attempt to correct the desperate economic plight of Depression Europe by finding the wrong culprit, so to speak, or by mistaking who the culprit was. So it seems to me that when we start pointing the finger of blame, we should be very careful how we do it. It's a point that we've made here frequently, that the result in the absence of a good political analysis, your politics can do the right thing only by accident. You've got to get the situation, you've got to describe the situation accurately before you can do anything appropriate to change it. And if you don't describe it accurately, you might do some terribly wrong things in trying to change it. Now look, we're sitting at the end of, well, hardly the end, but at the after 10 years of war against terror that is being expanded by the current administration in absolutely unexpected ways. The drone attacks that have killed people throughout Southwest Asia and Africa are an example of pointing the finger of blame in the wrong place, and in this case it's not done in any sense innocently. The Obama administration tells us it's killing terrorists. And it is carrying on the war on terror with these drone strikes. What, in fact, it's doing is trying to maintain the control of the energy-producing region that the U.S. has insisted upon, literally, for generations. But here we have pointing the finger of blame as an official policy of the Obama administration, and it justifies or pretends to justify the great crimes the administration is carrying out. So it's a crucial question you raise. Where do we point the finger of blame? Let's get it right, and let's not be seduced into consciously wrong answers, such as those as we're getting from the Obama administration.
What happens then, even if we do get it completely right, in your view? How do we punish or eliminate those people, or what happens then?
Well, it's the beginning of a political discussion, not the end. Suppose we understand that there are people who are responsible for the fact that there are people out of work in a society in which there is plenty of work to be done. We realize that the source of the economic difficulties that the country faces is the capitalist class, the 1%, as the Occupy Wall Street calls it. Then what do you do about it? Well, in fact, that should be the beginning of our political discussion. There has to be some way in which you can democratize the economic structure and eliminate the role, if not the actual physical existence, of the directors of the economy as it stands at the moment. Now, a century and more of social revolution has resulted in attempts to do this, attempts that have gone strikingly wrong. Tony Benn, the English politician, the prime minister who never was, says that the two attempts at socialism, the two attempts to correct the economy in his lifetime, both went wrong. Communism, and he's referring now to the Soviet experiment. Communism went wrong by ignoring democracy. Social democracy, and he says he's talking here primarily in terms of post-war Europe, went wrong by relapsing into capitalism. There has to be some way in which the two errors can be avoided, he says, but that is the political problem that our generation faces.
Yeah, well, the search for a scapegoat, the evil person who's the cause of all our problems, goes on. I mean, it's a perennial move to find that person or group. And then what do we do with them? Well, I think that remains a very interesting question, shall we say.
Yeah. And the question for our program in particular, since we emphasize the media and criticism of the media, and we have a lot of we point fingers of blame at a lot of the usual suspects in the media who are, create a what's in the current lexicon called a target-rich environment for
Yes.
for such criticism. The question is, where do they, how ingenuous or disingenuous are we being in emphasizing the blame of certain people who are, as a person, Belen Fernandez, who wrote a critical book about Thomas Friedman, titled it "The Imperial Messenger," in terms of defining Friedman's role. And people like Friedman and David Brooks, who we refer to commonly in this program, are easy targets and certainly are part of the problem. But the question becomes how, as in the larger perspective of the media being an aspect of the thought control and the limits of allowable debate, how are fingers pointed at them in a way which is useful and which doesn't diminish the power, the real people who benefit from the system, of which journalists are again pretty far down the ladder of the people who profit enormously from this.
Yeah, the second line in the observation that in the absence of a good analysis, politics can only do the right thing by accident. The second line is that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The task is to change it. In other words, you've got to find some ways in which this situation can be altered, and your hesitation, I suppose it is, Ron, at the attempts to alter the situation by shooting the people that are seen to be responsible for it is reasonable, if not for some other reason, because it's ineffective. It doesn't, in fact, change the situation. So, you're watching News from Neptune. We are launched on a variety of notions here. Perhaps, David, you want to raise another one?
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems like it's the time in our program where we should blame the Jews. And, it's been, of course, a difficult week. We're speaking 2 days after a ceasefire was called in the recent the recent Israeli attack on Gaza, and it just I'm not there's been a lot of sort of instant analysis and sort of conclusions made on the basis of these events. I'm not terribly comfortable, but even with people I greatly respect, but to begin with someone who we mention often on this program, Norman Finkelstein. He has a new website up. He was down for quite a while. Now he has a new website, and he had a kind of terse follow-up to the Gaza business, and basically concluding that this is simply another example in which Israel, in a number, starting with Lebanon in 2006 and Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, and this in which Israel is being revealed, its strategies are being revealed as increasingly ineffectual as a deterrent and as a kind of a way of flexing its muscles and seeing this as a kind of victory, as it has been it's even being advertised or promoted in the New York Times. At least it's being transmitted that the Gazans themselves feel victorious. They're certainly relieved, and certainly there are accurate reports of the people going into the streets after a week of having to stay in hiding, and that there's a sort of triumphalism about not only surviving this, but the fact that the pressure was put on Israel to stop, reportedly from our own government, and perhaps partially from the existence, however tenuous, of a new Middle East, particularly symbolized by Egypt, and the fact that the diplomacy in settling, in arranging the ceasefire was centered around Egypt and its new leader Morsi, who interestingly at the same time is declaring himself a kind of pharaoh. So there's another thing going on there, and I'd like to wonder if those things relate to each other, whether this power grab by him is also in relation to his perception of his increased stature in that part of the world and his ability to be a kind of power broker. But in any event, it's been a difficult week because what we've had to do is rehash all of the usual rhetoric that comes from the Zionist point of view or the Israeli point of view about them having a right to defend themselves. We've had to witness Obama, of course, avidly supporting their quote-unquote right to defend themselves. Mm-hmm. We've had to witness the U.S. Congress unanimously supporting resolutions that affirm Israel's acting in self-defense, and what would we do if hundreds of rockets were being released at us, and so we've had to endure all this usual rhetoric. But in the midst of that, as we repeat this cycle over and over again, I think each time it becomes an educational moment for more and more people, and that more and more people understand the absurdity of Israel claiming it's a victim of Gaza, and the sort of the gross inversion of reality that goes along with that. So, on the other hand, in opposition or in criticism perhaps of the optimistic view of Finkelstein and other people, we don't see any, and for all the claiming that from an anti-war point of view, say on antiwar.com, from the sort of libertarian point of view, from the point of view that somehow with each of these conflicts it's being increasingly revealed that Israel allegedly operates in its own interests and in violation of U.S. interests in the region. I don't, as usual, quite get that. I don't quite see where the United States, there may be a slight modification of how we perceive our interests in the world as a result of the Arab Spring and the consequences of the Arab Spring, but it's not clear yet that there's been a real sea change or any hint of a sea change in how we see our relationship with Israel in the context of it being our long-term strategic asset in that part of the world.
Don't you think there's a problem there for Israel in that they are seeing after the Arab Spring that there are fewer surrounding states and governments that can be or are being bought off by the USA?
Yeah, I think that is something that is happening. I mean, there is sort of a new context, very complicated. I mean, it was interesting to see that the Prime Minister of Egypt went to Gaza, that Qatar, which is a force, Qatar is sort of an old guard force along with the Saudis and the Gulf states in relation to whatever genuinely democratizing and revolutionary forces are happening. It's interesting to see that they're sort of weighing in on the Gaza thing in a different way. I wouldn't claim to understand it yet. I don't I don't pretend to have any inside dope on all this, but there's something happening here, but it's not exactly clear.
Yeah. I would say the same about Turkey too, which is a
Exactly.
big question mark to me. But
Yeah.
I found the most disturbing thing about my correspondence during the week, during this last week, is things from a number of people from various perspectives and indeed various degrees of education, writing me some version of the notion that brave little Israel is here surrounded by a sea of Arabs, and obviously they have to fight back because the Arabs want to eliminate them, and we have to avoid a second Holocaust by allowing Israel to defend itself. An aversion, in other words, of exactly what President Obama was saying, and the sort of thing that the really quite shocking resolution that was passed unanimously in the House and the Senate said. Now, I'd like to think that events make it less possible to buy this outright fabrication, but I must say, I think for Americans at least, given the corruptions of our media and the corruptions of our presidential accounts of what the American policy is doing too, of course, that's not happening. I mean, I'm not sure that the thoroughly propagandized American electorate is really seeing anything different here from the sorts of nonsense that they've believed all along, and that those resolutions in Congress seem to me to be perhaps the best example of it.
And certainly if one looks at, I mean, this is, again, fish in a barrel, but if you look at Charles Krauthammer, whose column was printed in our morning newspaper, just as radically, as radical in the worst sense of that word as you could possibly imagine, in inverting reality in a way that is still pretty standard in the mainstream media on CNN as well as Fox News. I mean, you have Wolf Blitzer over there, doing his thing, and I mean, Wolf is looking a little shell-shocked these days, I have to say, but still, he epitomizes it because he started out as an Israeli journalist, as a Zionist Israeli journalist, working for the from the government view of the media over there, and he's become a fixture on CNN all these years, and he certainly isn't at all capable of questioning the standard line.
A lot of people have this problem. I mean, the lead correspondent from the New York Times has a son in the Israeli army, right?
Well, actually, Ethan Bronner, who you're referring to, has been back here for a while, although he was sent back here for this. But there was actually a very interesting exchange that went on this week with the woman who replaced him, a woman named Jody Ruderin, who not only writes on the New York Times, but blogs pretty openly on her Facebook page. And she was kind of caught, pardon the expression, with her pants down by the blogger Philip Weiss on his mondoweiss.net, who really pointed out some really pretty horrible comments. I mean, she's seen as trying to be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but in her coverage of the days after the primary killing in Gaza, she was writing stuff that had a very colonialist, racist feel to it, or beyond that, it was clearly a lack of the old sort of line that they don't suffer the way we do.
Yes.
That's sort of and sort of the old invoking the old Golda Meir line is that they need to learn to love their own children more than they hate Jewish children. That kind of stuff. And she got called on that, and she kind of had to backtrack on it a little bit. But it just shows that even when they're trying to actually send a American journalist to cover in Gaza and to report on that perspective, she, as a woman from Newton, Mass, educated at Stanford and so on and so forth, sort of going the usual route to the kind of route that Noam Chomsky refers to in terms of what kind of baggage a person already has to have if they're going to rise up in an organization like the New York Times. Well, she has a lot of trouble getting beyond that, and if she did get beyond that, she'd probably be out of work. Just like Chris, the example of someone who left that line of work was Chris Hedges.
She spent the week actually in Jerusalem, did she not? I mean, she wasn't in Gaza at all, was she?
I thought she was.
Was she?
Yeah,
okay.
I think she was. Yeah.
I did like the statistic or the information that came from Jerusalem that the claim by the Israeli government for a number of Israelis injured by the rocket attacks from Gaza included people who had gone to their doctors to say they were suffering from anxiety about rocket attacks. Those were counted as injuries in Israel when the government said, well, we've had a good number of, we haven't had that many people killed, of course, but we have had people injured. Folks are upset. Those are injuries. Yeah. Well, okay. I mean,
they made me feel stressed.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Despite the supposed ceasefire, I read that another Palestinian was killed by the IDF this morning and 7 injured, and so on. So it's not really holding. But I think as long as they keep the number of Palestinians killed down to maybe 5 or fewer each day, that there won't be an enormous outcry.
For some reason, when I heard that story, it reminded me of the old Civil War song, All Quiet Along the Potomac, which begins, all quiet along the Potomac except where a lonely picket is shot. Just one guy killed and so forth. And then the song is on about that. Completely forgotten song now because it doesn't fit in with the military enthusiasm for the Civil War that I'm shocked to see being rekindled these days by the new Steven Spielberg movie, and the fact that he's got one of the best actors of the generation playing Lincoln seems to me to be unfortunate in the sense that it doesn't lead to our any greater understanding of what the military and political situation of the 1860s was. And since that's used as a template for so many things we're talking about today, it's dangerous that we have this sort of mythology kicking around there. I'd like to see it lead to a real discussion of what the politics of those days were and the false political analyses that exist in the current world, where President Obama is paralleled with Lincoln. He's done it himself, of course, and Lincoln is seen as the hero who is bringing the social evils to an end.
Do you expect that, or even hope for it in a mass market film?
Sure,
What?
of course.
Is
important here.
Is Spielberg sort of buying into the whole team of rivals kind of concept, or is that not related to all this?
I'm afraid so. I mean, the way that it's being bruited about in the press, including, I think, David Brooks this morning, the notion is, well, here we show the sort of dirty things that have to be done by a political leader if he's going to accomplish anything, and in order to, you have to draw straight with crooked lines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a justification of whatever other chief executive might occur to you at some point.
Well, I mean, when I think about this idea, then what occurs to me is this notion that's being perpetrated along with the false notion of the fiscal cliff is the notion of a grand bargain.
Yep.
And that is, very much the idea that there has to be a bipartisan solution to the rich getting richer and the middle class getting poorer, as well as the poor getting poorer. in terms of social benefits and so forth.
I wanted to suggest as my sort of ignored topic for the day, a peculiar move that's going on in this administration, and it's not unconscious, it's not an accident, to use identity politics to accomplish the goals that are in fact imperialist. And a number of commentators, including Melissa Harris Perry, who has herself a television show and a seat at the table at The Nation and a number of other places, are examples of this. But there are a lot of other things like that, like this going on. I was struck, for example, during the anti-NATO demonstrations in Chicago, how Amnesty International arranged a counter program, which was saying essentially, no, the U.S. and its NATO allies have to stay in Afghanistan because if they leave, it will be bad for the women of Afghanistan. And they put together a panel on that point that included, amazingly enough, originally was to include Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State. Albright did not, in fact, show up for the panel. I mean, maybe they realized they'd pushed it a little too far. But the attempt by Amnesty International, supposedly left progressive, organization, to undercut the anti-NATO demonstration by using essentially identity politics seemed to me to be interesting, and the result of a conscious program by the administration. I've seen another example of this just this week. Julian Assange, head of WikiLeaks, sheltering in the Ecuador embassy from the attempts of the U.S. to interfere not only with his free speech, but the good bit of the rest of his life as well, was supposed to give a speech at Cambridge University, and the speech was canceled when there were major demonstrations by a woman's group in Cambridge, in the university, against having an accused rapist speak on campus. The charges that Assange is supposed to face in Sweden are some version of sex offense or rape. And the speech was in fact canceled. Once again, an identity politics here used to limit free speech on the very things that the Obama government wants to limit free speech on. That is what WikiLeaks is talking about. Is there a trend here, gentlemen? Do we see something going on that identity politics once again is coming to the rescue of the liberal establishment?
Oh yeah, well, that's become an old story. Objections due to what they claim is racism or sexism or anti-Semitism or some other forbidden mental act. And I think it's really obscured and largely destroyed any kind of rational political discussion we might have.
Well, we have another example coming up. If, in fact, Hillary Clinton goes to her unjust reward, and as a ex-Secretary of State, the awful Susan Rice, as you note, Ron, I refer to her all the time, will probably be nominated to succeed her. And already the lines are being drawn by the administration's defenders saying, well, of course, the people who object to Rice object to her because she's either, your choice, black or a woman. So, that's the only reason they could possibly object to her. Now, there are some people, of course, who see this a little more clearly. The wonderful Black Agenda report, for example, which always should be read, says, I quote, as African Americans circle the wagons around Susan Rice, one of the most bellicose, bomb at the drop of a hat, Africa-bashing professional servants of power in Washington, America's carefully crafted house of cards in the Middle East faces collapse. So they at least bring it back from the realms of identity politics to the question, like the question you were raising in terms of the economists, David, as who in fact is setting policy in this administration.
Yeah. But the question is, what is the racism is still a problem, sexism is still a problem.
Sure, it's there.
Violence against women is a problem. So how do these diversionary tactics actually affect dealing with those problems in our society? I know that we argue or imply in many instances that there's a fundamental class basis to all this. There isn't a fundamental class basis to every aspect of racial issues or gender-related issues or gender identity-related issues, but still, those dealing with those issues in an effective and concrete way, I don't see it's helped by invoking race and gender when we talk about Susan Rice or Hillary Clinton or anyone else. And beyond that, look at Africa. I mean, Africa is sort of in the news a lot these days because of what's going on in the East Congo and so forth. How to understand what's going on there? This is part of a long-term process. In fact, Obama and Susan Rice, I think, are very interested in this process. There's a lot going on. I think that one of Obama's legacies in foreign policy might be a commitment, an American military commitment to Africa that might not have, that can be attributed perhaps to him even more so than previous presidents. So what's going on there? There's an article to begin with. There's an article in the Nation by a guy who also posted this or linked to this on his usually contributes to Mondoweiss, a guy named James North who talks about this. And there's also, I think, an article today on ZNet that really is exploring. We need to go back and understand Rwanda, because we don't. Mm-hmm. And all of these things have created a kind of backdrop, a kind of narrative. I know that's a word we've supposedly taken to the gallows, but the narrative about the Rwandan genocide needs to be clarified, so we understand what we're doing in East Africa and Rwanda, Uganda in relation to East Congo, to the eastern part of the Republic of Congo.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I object to is the rational discussion of a lot of these things has become essentially impossible because of the instant cries of racism that will go up no matter what you say about it in any direction. It's become impossible to discuss.
But Africa
has become... You can't give into that, though.
Yeah.
Africa has become a playground for the what's called the academic Mahmoud Mamdani, an academic from who is from Uganda, I think.
I think so.
In terms of he began to talk about this in relation to Darfur and all of the propaganda and misinformed analysis of what was going on in Darfur, and kind of diversionary analysis where we were in Afghanistan, we were in Iraq, and all of a sudden we're talking about Darfur. There are things to talk about, but it was being talked about in a way, obviously a very clearly a way that made it, that didn't clarify any of American goals in any of those regions.
How do you understand, for example, David, what you referred to, one of the legacies of the Obama-Rice administration, perhaps, might be a military commitment to Africa?
Yeah.
How do you mean that? Unpack that.
Well,
so, as they say, another phrase that should go to the
From what I understand, I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time reading about this, but AFRICOM is apparently on the rise. I'm not sure if that started with Obama or has just been expanded under Obama. But I mean, a lot of this is about China, and also it's about resources. And so, this is something we need to keep our eye on, because this, things are getting. It arose a little bit with the death of the leader of Ethiopia a while back, and talking about what our relationship with them has been for the last 20 years. Somalia, Ethiopia's invasion of Somalia. So it's a complex thing, but it's an arena of not of humanitarian response, but of imperial conflict.
We're running short on time. We're going to have to cut Coburn's Corner today, but we will save our nominees for the guillotine, literary nominees for the guillotine.
I'll be fraught until then.
Yeah. Fraught. Oh, you slipped yours in, huh? Fraught. Okay, you get one, Imran. What's your one?
Yeah.
One for Coburn's Corner.
At the end of the day, and the bottom line.
I have fraught, end of the day. Mine is service. Prompted by, like all good Americans, I sat and watched the NFL, the National Football League, to celebrate Thanksgiving. And several times I saw an ad where a very polite young soldier in fatigues, getting on and off an airplane, is thanked for his service by some authority figure or another. And I was reminded of George Carlin's remark that service is a funny word for killing people. Those who have been in the service. Have you been in the service? So forth and so on. So that led on to some reflections on militarization in this society, prompted by the Petraeus affair. Yeah. That Glenn Greenwald was particularly good last week. So maybe we'll get fraught, end of the day, and service to the guillotine next week.
Yeah, well, I've been wanting to do more sensationalism here, so we can get a bigger audience.
Okay, good. Well, as I say, that's what we're trying to trying to do here. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been, of course, There Have to Be Some Limits edition. If our program interests you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org/livestream. On Saturday at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a repeat of this show. Sunday at 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with our friends David Johnson and Jim Iman. Weekdays at 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, 8 a.m., The Big Picture, and noon, The David Pakman Show. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.